Currently inside of the subway, Choso was present holding up a tied-up Yuji through a blood bind. Yuji's clothes were somewhat dirty in order to give the impression that Yuji and Choso had fought, when in reality they actually hadn't fought, but this was in their attempt to fool Jogo. As Jogo was preparing to force-feed the fingers to Yuji. And as Jogo took out the fingers, they could all hear a laugh that was coming from Yuji's body but not Yuji himself. No, the laugh was Ryo and Sukuna's laugh, as Todo realized the error in his plan. Despite all he had planned out and all the circumstances he had prepared for, there was one circumstance he wasn't ready for, which was the circumstance of Sukuna telling Jogo the plan. In Todo's mind, he didn't think that it would be likely that Sukuna would tell them at all, mainly because this would still mean that he was going to get the fingers, but then he realized that was foolish mainly because how they were planning to do it would have spread out the time for the fingers, would have made it much more likely for Yuji to resist. If Jogo was still awake and could significantly damage Yuji, this would end up heavily helping Sukuna's chance of taking over the body. As Todo then told Nanako to take a picture of Jogo and fast. As Sukuna told Jogo that Choso was a traitor and they were lying to him. And if he can knock out Yuji and reawaken Sukuna, then Sukuna will help Jogo in this battle. Jogo was able to see immediately how serious this was. Not just was Choso an enemy, but he also had Yuji here, who Yuji was the person who did most of the primary damage against Hanami. With Sukuna also revealing that Todo was here as well, which the knowledge that Todo was here made him even more on guard. After all, he was aware that Todo was one of the bigger reasons that they were able to defeat Hanami. Sure, yes, Yuji was the one who was much stronger, and had gotten stronger from that point, but at the same time, Todo was the one that was able to facilitate a lot of those hits. He wasn't too sure if Yuji would have beaten Hanami on his own or the other way around, but he was sure those two together were a pretty good match for him. Not to mention Choso also being here. Now Sukuna didn't mention Mimiko and Naniko, mainly because he did still want this to be a fun fight, plus he didn't think they were going to actually be able to contribute much at all anyways. As Yuji and Choso activated flowing red scale stack, Jogo began to put his hands together in order to attempt to make his domain expansion. He had no time to waste, as he attempted to cast his domain expansion, but suddenly, his hands were forced apart from each other. And every time he tried to force his hands back together, they went right back to that position. Nanako's curse technique was photo manipulation. Whatever she captured in her phone, she was capable of manipulating, however there were some costs. While in theory she could definitely rip Jogo apart through her phone, it would require a great deal of curse energy. The further she wanted to move someone and control their body through her phone manipulation, the more and more curse energy it would take. Even separating his hands right now was quite strenuous on her. However, because the distance was quite minimal of how much she would need to move Jogo, being just forcing his hands to not come together, it was something that she was capable of accomplishing. But even then, she had to admit she underestimated how powerful Jogo actually was, because she thought she'd be able to do this much easier, but she wasn't. Now, while she could have used her technique to give the others more mobility as well, that would also cost her a great deal of curse energy, and her focus was right now on making sure Jogo's hands would not come together. If Jogo was able to use his domain expansion, it would be game over for everybody. And Yuji and Choso were quick to take advantage of the fact that Jogo was caught off guard, as Choso fired out a piercing blood while Yuji went in, attempting to land a flowing red scale burst on Jogo. All the while, the blood from the blood binding that was around Yuji had now been removed, as that blood was now scattered all across the area. Jogo was just barely able to readjust himself on time as he created several ember insects that took the blow of the piercing blood. And while he did succeed in blocking Choso's attack, he suddenly heard the sound of a heartbeat behind him before a hard punch landed on his side. Yuji had taken advantage of the fact that he was focused on Choso in order to land a strike on his side. However, thanks to Yuji using flowing red scale burst with this strike, he actually ended up putting a hole in Jogo's side, one that Jogo's body began to regenerate from. As Jogo then thought, the hell? In terms of speed, he is close to my full speed, but in terms of power behind his strikes, no wonder he could damage Hanami with those hits. No wonder he could beat Manito all the way back then. As his side began to regenerate, but this was going to take quite a bit of time to heal as well as curse energy. After all, while this wasn't a Black Flash, he still was significantly less durable than Hanami, and Yuji had gotten a bit stronger since that point. Not by much, however in exchange his abilities had become a lot more refined, something Jogo was going to feel in this battle. As Jogo and Yuji entered into a hand-to-hand clash, punches were being thrown, but Jogo was on the defensive. After all, while the two of them were at the same speed, Yuji was more than making up for it in terms of his physical strength and his hand-to-hand natural ability. This was not something that Jogo was going to be able to keep up for long, so he lifted up his hand and fired out a huge burst of fire in that moment. He wasn't certain this would hit him, but he was certain this would at least make a bit of a distance. However, he heard a clap, as Yuji had swapped places with some of the scattered blood on the ground, and cursed energy engulfed Yuji's fists. The sound of his heartbeat increasing could be heard once more. He was attempting to use flowing red scale burst. And while he did land a punch on Jogo's back, this time was different. Noticeably, this one wasn't as potent as Yuji cursed himself. He was able to land a flowing red scale burst, but he wasn't able to land them back to back as easy yet. That was his current goal. He wanted flowing red scale burst to just be every single punch, but that was much easier said than done. And while Jogo did cough up some blood from that strike, it wasn't one that he was going to need to heal from, as he thought to himself, oh, he doesn't have full control. Alright, I can still win. The blood is the primary issue, so... As both Yuji and Choso clapped their hands together in order to use Piercing Blood, resulting in the Piercing Blood being fired at Jogo that Jogo was able to dodge, using lava to propel himself out the way. And once Jogo landed, he placed both of his hands on the ground. As the ground's temperature began to increase more and more, Yuji and Choso realized exactly what was about to happen, as Choso and Yuji both nodded to each other, able to communicate with each other without even needing to speak, as Choso clapped his hands together and fired out a Piercing Blood at the ceiling, while Yuji moved as fast as he could to pick up Nanako. Nanako was by far the slowest of the 4 present fighters, but they were also a very important piece of the battle. After all, they were the ones preventing Jogo from using his domain expansion. As Yuji hopped up to the ceiling carrying Nanako on one arm as he punched right through the ceiling. Both Yuji and Choso's hits would normally be enough in order to break through the ceiling, but them together easily was able to shatter it for them to escape, with Todo and Choso jumping after Yuji. They had just barely been able to avoid the lava burst coming at them as they landed. Jogo was sent flying out with that lava as a smile formed on Jogo. The side that was hit by the flowing red scale burst was now healed, but he knew he couldn't take too many of those attacks. Meanwhile, in the distance at a nearby building, Mimiko was inside of it with a total of 2 different stuffed animals. Mimiko's curse technique allowed her to hang people and make their bodies levitate through a ritual. However, thanks to a suggestion from Todo, Mimiko got an idea. Her technique allowed bodies to float in a way, so she was going to take advantage of that. And while Mimiko did want to use her curse technique on Jogo, she had nowhere near enough time to set up the conditions, plus it would take way too long for it to work on someone as strong as him. As Jogo could see all around him, several balls of hardened blood began to surround him, floating all around him. 10s of them from both Choso and Yuji, which meant they all had their curse energy signatures. However, while most of them were hardened blood, a few of them were rather unique, as 3 compressed blood orbs rose behind Jogo's back and exploded, as Jogo groaned in pain from the supernova about to turn around to try and fire a burst of magma. But when he turned around, he suddenly got a punch to the face, punching him off of the lava plume that he had caused for himself to stand on, which also resulted in Jogo being sent flying. This was a punch from Yuji, but there was something else that was quite notable. Not just did Yuji manage to jump up here, he wasn't falling. No, Yuji was floating right now. As 2 claps could suddenly be heard, as Yuji swapped places again to swap with one of the dry blood orbs, as the sound of his heartbeat increased once more. However, he suddenly remembered something else. There were 2 claps, not 1. But before he could try and figure out what the other clap was, or launch an attack, he was kicked in the back by Todo. Todo has now entered into the battlefield as Todo kicked Jogo into a punch from Yuji. While Jogo was sent flying, he lifted up his hands, beginning to send out rapid-fire bursts of lava towards both Yuji and Todo. This was when Yuji decided that he was going to show something else off, as he opened up both of his hands, creating 2 discs of blood. He was going to use Slicing Exorcism, as he began to throw several of these slicing discs toward the bursts of lava, cutting through each of them as they were sent flying at Jogo. Thanks to tips from Kamo, he was able to make the Slicing Exorcism significantly sharper in comparison to what it would normally be. All the while, Todo was repeatedly clapping in order to dodge each of the bursts of lava that were being sent towards him. Seeing that Slicing Exorcism wasn't going to work on someone like Jogo, Yuji clapped his hands together, preparing to cast a Piercing Blood. Todo was able to perfectly read what his brother was about to do. So the moment that Jogo dodged one of the Slicing Exorcisms, Yuji was swapped with that Slicing Exorcism as he fired a Piercing Blood right at Jogo's back. However, the Piercing Blood wasn't the most damaging thing. No, what it actually did was launch Jogo right into a Slicing Exorcism that Jogo was just barely able to dodge on time with a lava pillar launching himself into the air. And he did think for a moment that this might end up hitting Yuji, however Yuji ended up catching the Slicing Exorcism before throwing it right back at Jogo. This resulted in Jogo just barely dodging it, however he ended up with his left leg being cut off. This was a wound that he could regenerate pretty easily as his left leg grew right back in place. As Jogo began to attempt to summon several ember insects, he wanted to make a massive amount of explosions of fire just to make sure all of the blood would be gone, and a pretty good chance that it would hit Yuji and Todo. However, this was when Todo spoke, as Todo told him, "Aren't you forgetting someone?" as the same hand that was about to launch out the ember insects was pierced, right through by Choso's Piercing Blood. Choso was using Yuji and Todo as a distraction, as this was not just made to land a hit on him, but also trigger the ember insects before they could even be fired out. As Jogo groaned in pain from the piercing blood and the ember insects were about to explode, he looked up to Choso, about to try and fire an attack on him, but the sound of a clap echoed throughout the area. As the explosion of the ember insects swapped places, all of them swapping with Yuji Itadori, as the sound of that heartbeat increased could be heard once more. Yuji was focusing curse energy as his eyes were filled with determination, as he landed a punch on Jogo's side, activating flowing red scale burst, pushing himself to the limit, and he landed the punch, sending Jogo flying right through a building, causing quite a great deal of damage to Jogo, as Yuji coughed up some blood for a moment while clutching his chest. Yuji looked to be in absolute agony as both Choso and Todo looked concerned at Yuji, Choso immediately going over to check on his brother, and they could see the amount of pain that he was in until it stopped, as Yuji lifted up a hand and told them that he was fine, just feeling a little bit woozy. Unknown to them and Yuji himself, every time Yuji used flowing red scale bursts several times in a battle, it gave him a heart attack. However, Yuji was now subconsciously using reverse curse technique in order to repair his heart. But even then, repairing the heart costed a great deal of curse energy from Yuji. As Choso smiled a bit, he was happy to see that his brother was doing alright, but Todo was a bit more of an observer, and this actually seemed familiar, as he told Yuji that he believes Yuji can subconsciously use reverse curse technique, at least on his heart, similar to how another student named Akari used it, or well, student that had been kicked out from Jujutsu High, but from what he could tell, Yuji could only use it on his heart right now. However, Todo also explained that unlike Akari who could only use it subconsciously, he believed it was fully possible for Yuji to actually learn how to properly use it. As suddenly they could hear the sound of a building collapse. Jogo had been using this time in order to heal himself, in order to recover, as two large lava hands rose up from the ground in order to grab two buildings and throw them right at the group. Jogo was pissed beyond belief, pissed that these 5 sorcerers, these 5 random humans, were doing this much damage to him, were toying around with him like this, and at this point Jogo was so bloodlusted he didn't even care if he killed Yuji or not. Besides, he was pretty certain that Yuji would survive this considering everything he had survived so far, but at the same time he no longer cared. After all, this was a situation like Satoru Gojo where the sorcerer was so much stronger than them, then he would be able to accept it. Sure, yes, he would hate it, but he would have to accept it. But this was different. This was 5 sorcerers that were getting the better of him despite being so much weaker than him. However, Todo had more than enough time to counter this, as he began to clap repeatedly, swapping Yuji himself, Choso, as well as Mimiko and Naniko out of the way of the building, mainly because those buildings would definitely hit the building that Mimiko and Naniko were in. However, Jogo wasn't done yet. If he couldn't use a domain, then he'd use the second best thing. He hopped high into the air and activated Maximum Meteor. In another area in Shibuya, Kamo, Megumi, Nobara, and everyone else in that squad could see that massive meteor form, and sensed Yuji and Todo's curse energy. They really hoped they would have a way out of this. After all, there was no way that anyone would actually be able to survive an attack like this. Before they then saw what looked like 2 piercing bloods being fired out in the distance. Before they swapped places, it looked like 2 girls had landed where the piercing bloods were going to land. Todo was using Boogie Woogie to get them out and as far away as possible. A third piercing blood was fired to get Choso out as well. Yuji and Todo had one more plan though, as Choso began to scatter a large amount of blood in preparation for this plan where he was present. As the meteor got closer and closer to the 2 of them before Todo clapped and swapped his place with Jogo. Now Jogo was underneath the meteor and right next to Yuji. Jogo was caught off guard by this and very heavily confused, and he didn't have enough time, as Yuji focused one more time and uppercutted Jogo, sending him flying into the meteor while landing a flowing red scale burst. However, with that uppercut, Yuji did one more sneaky thing, which what he did was rob Jogo of the fingers that he was carrying. As Todo clapped with both Yuji and Todo appearing where Choso scattered the blood, as Jogo was hit and crushed by his own attack. It didn't take long for Mimiko and Naniko to join them as well, as they all began to rest a little bit. They had to regain their energy. After all, this was still a very hard fight, and they all had expended quite a lot of curse energy. Especially Naniko, considering the entire battle she had to make sure that Jogo was not capable of using his domain expansion. Fortunately for them, they did have a bit of time to rest, and while Yuji did really want to go immediately into the subway and try and find Manito, he knew that he needed to rest, and he knew that if he were to try and battle Manito, he would not stand a chance, especially with what he had heard from Choso that Manito had gotten even stronger. As we return now to Jogo's meteor, Jogo was just barely alive. The lower half of his body was completely missing. He was also missing his left arm. If it wasn't for the fact that it was his own curse technique, this certainly would have killed him, but because it was his own curse technique, it ended up lessening the damage. He just barely managed to survive this. This was also because Jogo at the last minute was able to manipulate some of the earth, so the impact would be a bit less, but even then he couldn't fully remove it. However, someone began to approach him, and in that moment Jogo realized he should have let himself die with what was going to happen next. as the person that was approaching him was Kenjaku. While Kenjaku was really tempted to go on a monologue, he could see that Jogo was about to die, and if he didn't do something now, then he wouldn't get the chance. So, he activated Curse Spirit Manipulation, turned Jogo into a ball, and consumed Jogo. Now in truth, he was hoping that Jogo would evolve in this battle, that Jogo would get stronger. After all, Jogo ended up in a 5v1 against several incredibly strong sorcerers, including his son. Now of course, Kenjaku was also hoping this would end up being a one-on-one battle between Jogo and Yuji instead of this massive 5v1 battle, but it is what it is. In truth, he didn't really care much at all about the reveal that Choso was a traitor. After all, in his mind, Choso couldn't really change what was going to come next. All that needed to happen now was the finishing touches, to make sure that Gojo was sealed, and that Mahito would evolve. Fortunately, Yuji had already somewhat served that purpose. After all, Mahito was pretty deep within his evolution already. All that Kenjaku felt was needed was one more push, and he would be able to absorb Mahito. As we return back to Yuji and the others, Yuji was able to see the level of physical exhaust that this entire battle put on Naniko and Mimiko, so he looked over to Choso and asked Choso a favor, to bring Mimiko and Naniko to where they were keeping their brothers. After all, he felt that was a safe place, and considering Mimiko and Naniko were previous enemies, they weren't too sure how the others would feel about having them on their side. Of course, he was pretty sure that things would be fine, but at the same time he didn't want to risk things, at least for now. He was going to wait until later. And the three began to leave, with Naniko thanking Yuji for saving her life back in the subway. And Choso also telling Yuji that he would be back as soon as possible in order to back up Yuji and Todo against Mahito. During this time also, Yuji had given the fingers to Todo. After all, he was pretty certain that if he opened the container that the fingers were in, that Sukuna would just find a way to immediately eat them all, and he would take control. After all, he was very certain that if he ate 10 fingers at once, there wouldn't be a chance that he could keep control over his body. So what Yuji was planning to do was effectively test how many fingers he could eat, and if he felt that Sukuna was starting to gain more and more ground in the control of his body, then he would stop and tell Todo to stop as well. However, Yuji was also pretty confident he would be fine. His body already adapted pretty fast, and considering how much stronger he had gotten in comparison to the start, he was pretty certain he could eat a lot of the fingers and be fine. This resulted in Yuji eating a total of 6 of the 10 fingers that Jogo had on him, so now Yuji has a total of 10 of Sukuna's fingers. Mainly because Mimiko and Naniko had given him 1, and coming into Shibuya he had 3 already. As a side note, the reason why Yuji came in with only 3 fingers and not 4 fingers was because Yuji was not present for the finger bearer mission, so Sukuna never really got the chance to snag the finger. This also leads to another side effect that Yuji wasn't fully expecting, which was his body was recovering even faster than it would be normally. And with their recovery done, with Todo not really needing to recover anything considering he didn't really get hit or barely fought in the fight, mainly just using his curse technique, the two of them believed that they were ready, as they head into the subway to begin to search for Mahito. And that is the end of this part of the What If. I'm curious to see what you guys thought of this part, but I'm gonna see y'all later. I hope y'all have a good day. Peace out.